BlockW and what we do, whenever you mention that we work within the area around blockchain, a lot of the first thing that happens is, that's Bitcoin, isn't it? So that's the first question I'm going to put to this panel. So is it just Bitcoin? Maybe Eoin, you can hop in.
You're right, it's a common misconception. So I'm a fintech advisor with Enterprise Ireland, which for anyone who doesn't know is the Irish government agency that works with startups and corporates to scale internationally. I look after Niall and AidTech as my client, and we did the first Enterprise Ireland investment in blockchain May last year. And it was great, but it took me probably the guts of 12 months, I'd say, to get through a process of education within the organization, because even myself, I'm far from an expert on it. I know a little bit more than some people, but I don't claim to know that much, as especially my co-panelists here. But I knew that, to get to a point where the government was going to be happy to invest in a company in the blockchain space, we really needed to work through a process of making sure it's not Bitcoin and everything that you would read in the papers about it. So, clearly the technology itself, it speaks for itself in terms of what it can do, but everything that you would read associated with Bitcoin and others. So there's a lot of education gone on and still going on around, where are the uses for the technology and how can it be valuable and how to separate it from maybe some of the elements that are not as pleasant around it.
Absolutely, and I think another thing that gets phrased out there is, well, is there just one blockchain? Is it the blockchain? So maybe we can also look at that, because obviously there are a variety of different blockchains and they're there for different purposes.
Misconceptions. Yeah, there's many blockchains. Kind of draw on the first question and segue into the second question and answer them. Bitcoin was kind of considered the first generation blockchain, and its only application was a currency. As was being said, there's obviously this blossoming, ecosystem of different applications on top of blockchains. Alongside that, we're starting to see second and third generation blockchains starting to emerge. So you may have heard of Ethereum before. That introduces a programmability aspect to blockchain, something that wasn't even possible in Bitcoin's blockchain. So it becomes almost this canvas with which you can build services on top of. And to kind of jump back and finally answer that, the question, that's another blockchain stack. And there's many, many more, all with their own kind of different sets of characteristics and so on.
Great, and obviously, Niall, great presentation, and we got to see real life use cases. Very rarely there's a lot being said about blockchain, but what's actually happening? Obviously for yourself at AidTech and what you've achieved, but there's also obviously a lot happening in investment, Eoin, as well.
Yeah, and obviously what the guys at AidTech are doing is, it's one of the few scalable, I suppose, products out there in the market at the moment. There's a lot of work going on in numerous different types of sectors, but there's not as, I think this year is more a year where we'll start seeing more solutions coming out of it, which is then backed by the investment. So I mentioned Enterprise Ireland did its first investment in blockchain last year. I think we work with maybe 10 companies now in the space, and we've invested in maybe 5 or 6, I suppose, in the last 12 months. Which from an Irish point of view is really, really promising, but also speaks to the development of the technology. And coming back to some of your earlier points around the misconception, it's fundamentally, it's a technology, no different to others. It's just a new technology, and a lot of people get confused by what they'll read in the paper about it, without realizing it's just a layer of technology of which multiple things will be built upon, in multiple different sectors. And it's that kind of confusion, and because it sounds so kind of crazy and out there, but it's no different to the internet whenever that was invented, I don't know, 20 years ago or whatever. It's like that then, it's still the same. So hopefully with the likes of AidTech and some of the other Irish companies, there's Gecko Governance, there's Moe Coffee, we've large players like Consensus in the market here. Obviously Waxman work with a lot of, your former employer worked with a lot of large companies or companies doing stuff internationally in blockchain. So there's more and more, and I think in maybe a year's time, again, we look back and say, there's been so many companies now providing blockchain solutions that it just becomes a norm and people are more used to seeing it then.
And so Niall, from your experience over the, I see AidTech and yourself and your co-founder Joe traveling the world with what you're doing. Education must be a huge part of that too, because when you're going into a business meeting, I'm sure you get a lot of questions and a lot of things asked. So have you seen the level of awareness around the technology rise quite a lot over the past number of years?
That was really the first thing we did back in 20. We started off really in 2014, working on the technology. The biggest misconception we had, we chose like a really difficult market to work with, which was international aid initially. We've since branched out from that, but the question we kept getting asked was, I've heard of Bitcoin. Is that to do with the Silk Road, this dodgy website where you can buy weapons, you can buy drugs, and all that kind of bad stuff, or some people might say good stuff in the audience. But that was the biggest misconception we had to dispel, that look, we are completely clean, we're completely trustworthy. I showed you Christine Lagarde up there. We put a lot of effort. Our strategy was to go out and win competitions. And I think Eoin probably got sick of us when we came to him. Eoin, we just won another competition. We won this one. We got MasterCard. We've got Citi. We've got IBM. But the reason we did that was very intentional, that we thought we have to like dispel the myth that we are just another crypto company based on speculation. And I can remember we went over to Geneva to the International Federation of the Red Cross. Literally sat with them for 2 weeks. I thought what we've got to do is go in, embed ourselves with the customer, find out how they think, develop the technology alongside them, which we did. And really, I ran workshops, I think, for about a week, and they didn't pay us anything at the time, which I thought, that's ominous, but anyway. But we'd really educate them, this is the technology, here's the implications that it can have. And even to this day, a big part of what we do is education. And for myself and Joe, that you mentioned, and you talked about the travel that we do, and he's the guy with the big quads that we showed earlier on. I'm kind of jealous with my little skinny legs. He's the guy who really gets out there, meets with people, and it has been for us a lot of education. And I like to say that in Ireland, I compared, I said this before, but if you think about the history that Ireland has with missionaries, I like to think that we were kind of like the first blockchain missionaries out of Ireland. We're a mission-driven company. And funny enough, a lot of the places that we went to, I'm going a little bit off topic, which I do, there was a lady called Dr. Jamila Mahmood, great partner of ATEC, and she's the Under-Sec General of the International Federation of the Red Cross from Malaysia, from Penang. And when I met her first, she said, my first teacher was from Tralee in County Kerry. It's funny that another Irishman has shown up here, or an Irish person on the door, but you're speaking about something very different, which was blockchain. But I think Irish people were pretty good at the education side of things, and we thought, we had to do the same, but albeit in a different guise.
Excellent. And obviously, so we're seeing it from one industry to then yourself. At Truffle, maybe you can explain a little bit to the audience about what Truffle does, but equally the organizations you work with, because that does provide extra insight into the use cases that we're seeing globally.
Yeah, so Truffle is basically tools for building applications on top of blockchains. It started as a tool set specifically for Ethereum, because when Ethereum launched back in 2016, I think, because you can build things on top of it, you need tools to do that. It's got its own programming language or languages. There's things you need to do to kind of, once you've built something, to deploy it to the blockchain, or Ethereum's blockchain. I started playing with it a bit back then, and it was cumbersome to say the least. It was to the point where I'm like, is this going to take off in any meaningful capacity? Because it was so hard. Truffle came along, it was found by a guy called Tim Coulter, to kind of smooth out that process. And it's just kind of blossomed and grown from there. So it's become, at least for Ethereum development, the most popular suite of tools. We've had like 1.7 million downloads now.
Congratulations.
We're also now starting to support other blockchains. Come back to the earlier point that there are multiple. Ethereum is not just one of them. Of course, it's not just Bitcoin's blockchain. And to explore a little bit around the different types of companies, to the other part of the question, you name it. There's everything from your kind of finance type firms, everything from younger stage, startups, you could say, decentralizing finance, through to traditional financial services firms exploring it in their own ways. Like JP Morgan have launched their own coin. It's called JPM Coin, built on top of something called Quorum, which is an open source flavor of Ethereum. Getting a little techie there, but that's kind of finance, gaming, kind of assets within games, almost at the other end of the spectrum, from very sort of sterile industry, albeit important, through to something very different. So that's being explored out, on how you kind of can build assets that are stored on blockchains that you can maybe buy a sword in one game and reuse it in another game, and it's yours. It's not centrally owned. That's something that's come up in your presentation earlier about these things aren't owned by any given company, and then everything in between. Sort of identities, healthcare. And one other point, just on this final point for me on this, I think from an inspirational standpoint, it really, it's good to think of it as a different paradigm, and re-emphasizing that kind of decentralized aspect of it, that no one owns it other than you. The assets that you own, be that your identity, be that your healthcare records, be that financial, assets, they're yours, and no one can take them away from you. And that is a different paradigm because enabled by the technology. So it does require different thinking. It is still a technology, at the end of the day, but it's different to what we've ever had really before. And I think that's why it's got so much buzz, but also why it's been quite misunderstood as well. And people have perhaps labeled, oh, it can save the world, it can do everything. Of course it can't, but it is also quite different too.
Yeah, because I've heard, around industries, I hear two different misconceptions quite frequently. One is finance is the only industry that blockchain gets applied to, which of course isn't true. But at the same time, you've also heard blockchain's for every industry. It can cure everything. It is the answer to all problems, which I think does contribute to the hype. So looking at some of the features that blockchain holds, if you had to pick one or two that you think are really promising and that have the ability to drive it forward, that are applicable to a lot of industries, what would you be looking at?
I'd be looking at Trace Donate for traceable donations, tracedonate.com. We would see like identity is really the cornerstone, and for the bigger mission with ATech is that it's not one particular niche, but I guess back to what Kevin alluded to is putting the infrastructure in place now to change up the industries, and we see that then as application programming interfaces linked to identity, which can then be linked to payments, which can be linked to services that you want to own. But despite my practical examples there, it's the infrastructure is the thing that we're focused on building. But I would say that I think welfare distribution, which believe it or not then with the 35, I think it's 35 at the moment, OECD countries, I was on a spreadsheet recently totting this up, but they distribute every year $8.8 trillion of welfare. And even in Ireland alone, there's about 400 million euros worth of welfare every year that can't be properly accounted for. In the UK, it's 4 billion. So to bring an element of transparency, but more importantly, to ensure that the right people get the right entitlements, like welfare, I think that's going to be a big one. And that's where we're getting quite a lot of traction. And remittances, a lot of people in that space now at the moment, but anything that's moving across a border, where there's a lot of friction, and you oftentimes don't know where your money is at any given point in time. I think you mentioned JPM coin, etc., and Citi are coming out with their own stable coin. I would see moving value across borders and bringing more transparency and efficiency to the distribution of resources by particularly governments. I think they can be, how would I put it, maybe a little bit inefficient.
And I think to that point, the way I would see it, because obviously I look after financial services, but to me the key benefit of it, or potential of it, is traceability. Obviously it's what the guys focus on with AidTech, but where we see more happening is actually outside of financial services. So it's supply chain. In financial services, it's maybe in trade. It's where there's a process and you want to be able to track and make sure that everything happens in the right order and you can see and look back on everything. So it's things like food. I mentioned supply chain solutions, all that sort of stuff. It's anywhere where there's a requirement to be able to track something or give something to someone and make sure that they get it and are then able to use it. Like we have a client, Travelcoin, which does refunds of airline trips that you can't make, so you get the money refunded to you and then you can use it in the airport. Again, it's to be able to make sure that the right person gets what they're owed and then has it to use. And from a feature point of view, it's that traceability piece.
I'll add one thing. I agree. I think what was said was awesome. So I don't want, and would probably start with those if I were to answer it myself. One thing I think that is very important, that has historically been a bit of a weakness of it, is the user experience. Like whether it's setting up a wallet, doing different types of things, has always been quite cumbersome and still is. That said, it's getting a lot better. Even in the last 6 months, we see just lots of kind of niche kind of projects bubbling up where they really thought about the user experience from the ground up. So I think it's still to be solved, or it's being solved, but it's important. Kind of your point around importance, I think, was the kind of one of the question, or the gist of the question. So I think it's vitally important if we are going to really derive the ultimate, fulfill its potential as a paradigm, as a technology. it needs to be usable and easy enough for for us collectively to use. If it's just for techie geeks or whatever, it's not really ever going to take off. So I think it's that's really, really important. It's being solved, but it's still not quite there yet.
Yeah, and I suppose that brings on to one of the last misconceptions, I think, is that, blockchain has all the answers, not perfection, but it is great in every way. But there has to be some drawbacks to this technology. And even not just the technology itself, but drawbacks to how it's evolved or its adoption. Eoin, maybe on your side?
Yeah, so I suppose part of the hype at the start of it was that it's a solution to everything. And we often come across companies who want to apply blockchain to something where it doesn't actually fit. They just think that, and you see it like there was the Long Island ice company that put blockchain in their name and their shares went up. Just, there's like ridiculous examples, or it being the solution to the Brexit border, like, just because it might be a solution, stupid stuff. So it hasn't got past that. It still hasn't got past that because I don't think at the moment there are enough solutions or products in widespread use yet. So I wouldn't even say that they're scaling. It's still, the technology is still new. So even in terms of the progress that the guys are making separately on their own products, they're still a couple of years away from it being more widespread use before you can really say that it's the solution to a lot of problems. Scaling is still a challenge at the moment, and it comes down to a lot of things, like you said, around the functionality of it and the user experience. So I think right now it's that it hasn't met the hype, but that's because the hype was a bit out of control still. It will get there, but it is important to remember it's just an emerging technology still.
Amongst many different emerging technologies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I found really interesting. Working in the industry, you think, is there this much conversation around the others? And many times the startups that you work with or the organizations you work with aren't just using blockchain, but they're using with a suite of all the other emerging technologies because they see that as the way to meet the problem that they have, that they require a solution for. What about yourself, Kevin? Is there anything from a drawback?
I think, the hype, the drawback on the sort of journey of the technology thus far, and I think we already touched on this, but just to kind of re-emphasize it, a little bit of a victim of its own success. Particularly you may have heard the acronym ICO, stands for Initial Coin Offering. So it's a kind of fundraising mechanism that really exploded like too much roughly about a year ago. It was we were hitting the kind of peak of it. So, and it became everyone just saw, not everyone, but a large number of companies waded in just as a means of getting rich quick, and became very scammy and so on. So I think that, and the technology enables it. It removes the friction to raise money, but I think almost became too easy, and everyone waded, it became too scammy. And I think that set the technology back as well. Same with things like the Silk Road, and some of these things is how much was it bottom up versus top down? Maybe the technology was trying to be tarnished, smeared a little bit, maybe, I don't know. But either way, it's definitely not, it's had a kind of bumpy, rocky ride.
Like most technologies.
Yeah.
So to end on a more positive note, what does the future hold for the technology? Do you think we will be still talking about beyond the hype, in 2 or 3 years' time, or what are we going to be seeing real life in addition to what we already have? Anyone?
So I should just point out, look, I'm in sales mode today, but scalability, deployability issues we've addressed. We've open sourced some technology that enables people to deploy a blockchain network on Kubernetes using something called Nephos. We've open sourced that, so have a look at our website. But in terms of the big things that I think will happen, I'm biased on identity. I think identity is going to be a big thing that the blockchain will enable, this idea of a decentralized identifier. I think people owning their own data, and as Kevin alluded to and owned, I think that's going to be the big thing with blockchain. Just this week, Microsoft came out with their Ion project. A number of different players are, touting the benefits of, possibly because of the tech clash that we're seeing at the moment. But I think to enable people to control their data, which is something we've all been talking about, then I think the blockchain, it's not the only way to do it, but to build trust. I guess I'd sum it up, whenever I think, is there a useful use case for blockchain, I think I sum it up like this, is that if you want to incentivize parties who would sometimes compete against each other to be in alignment over the version of the truth, the blockchain is the way to do that. but ultimately people then must have their identity and control that data. But for me, I think that's going to be the big one, not just because tech is going after it, but believe it or not.
No.
Never.
Okay.
Yeah, I think definitely identity. That's similarly something I participated in a hackathon in Hong Kong last year on a different technology, on EOS, which is another blockchain, going back to an earlier point, and we did a project around decentralized identity, just as a hackathon style thing. So I'm super bullish on that. I'd love to have my own kind of meaningful ID there. To extend on that, healthcare records as well. I live in the US at the moment, and it's a mess. Everything's siloed. You go to one hospital, there are ways to transfer records around, but it's not really your data, right? When it is, of course, the most almost like your identity, very, very personal data to you. So it's kind of very good. It needs to be done well and properly, and properly secured and so on, and privately done. But that, to me, similar to identity, but healthcare as well, just to put out there.
I know Eoin is going to say, since EI have made the investment, that the next big thing in blockchain is your first investment, ATech.
Obviously, it's going to be ATech in the next 2 to 3 years. No, well, actually, I'm going to take a slightly different view to what the guys are saying, ATech aside. I actually think that the best thing that can happen in the next 2 or 3 years is that there's just more regular day-to-day use in a person's life. So identity, absolutely, I see where that makes sense. But that's like trying to boil the ocean. Like, that's not going to happen in 2 or 3 years, in my view. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but like, there are so many different moving parts to that. But yet, donating to charity, that, I think the average Irish person donates something like €40, a week, over the course of a year, something like that. So, using that solution and then doing something else in my kind of day-to-day life, where blockchain underpins it, I think that's the best thing we can hope for in the next couple of years, that it just becomes something that we're used to using without even realizing it, in the same way that you use Facebook and it's on the internet and everything happens in the background without you even thinking about it. That's what I'd prefer to see. The bigger things will come, but I think you need to get, 50 regular uses of it in your daily life before you're going to sign up to my identity being on the blockchain.
What a good ending. So I'd ask you all to give a really good round of applause here for our panel. So thank you very much, Eoin.